makes no sense. So they are contagious one day, but not the next. I assume talking about the students there. And
Correct.
that's a little
The
bit going
line
to what
behind the every other day model, though, is that the schools are trying to limit how many kids are in school on a given day. They're trying to limit the crowds. They're trying to encourage or enable social distancing so that they can keep kids 6 feet apart as much as possible. I mean, you're right. If a student is contagious, they're going to be contagious one way or the other. If they're asymptomatic and contagious, that's going to be a problem no matter how many kids are in school or how few kids. The idea behind the every other day is to limit the crowds and to encourage social distancing.
And we should mention too, putting up that comment from Kira there, saying basically what you were just saying there, Kevin, about social distancing with limiting the number of students, without a doubt. So many students, we saw an influx. Idaho Ed News reported on this last week after the school board, I'm talking specifically about West Ada here, after the West Ada school board met last Tuesday, there was a flood of parents trying to meet the virtual schoolhouse deadline, which was set for Wednesday. One day later, on August 26th, you had to sign up in West Ada to get into the virtual schoolhouse. And they did. They saw, as Idaho Ed News reported, 1,200 new students flood into the virtual academy.
Right. So I want to say you've got more than 4,000 students now in West Ada that are enrolled in the online school. And you're right. I think exactly what's happening with parents in West Ada, similar to what we saw with parents in Boise. A lot of parents right now, they just want something that they can, rely on, that they know that they have some predictability, that they know that from week to week and from day to day that, their kids are going to be learning from home, that they're just going to have to adjust as a family to the in-home learning model. Doesn't make it easy. We know that. But I think for a lot of parents, what they're reaching for right now is just some kind of stability. Even if what's stable right now isn't optimal, at least they know it's coming, and at least they can make plans long term, as opposed to, kind of riding the roller coaster maybe of school in session, school not in session.
I understand that. As a parent, it's nice to know what exactly is happening with your kids and your family. I totally get that. One of the interesting things that Idaho Ed News was reporting on, Kevin, that I'd like us to touch on briefly is what the Boise School District is doing. They've kind of put together, as you reported, this coronavirus spreadsheet where they are tracking cases inside the school district. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Right. So Boise District has posted something on their website, a web page that's going to track the case numbers from week to week and from school to school. And I think that's going to be really interesting for us to watch, to sort of see where the trends are within those schools. And that's especially important if and when Boise opens its doors and kids are back in school and teachers are back with kids. Then those numbers become really important. What we've just seen over the past couple of months is, as you can see here, 32 cases since June, largest concentration of cases in headquarters, in the central district offices. Those numbers are going to change in time, and they're going to change if and when schools open. So this is a data sheet that parents can watch, and certainly a data sheet that we as reporters are going to be watching.
I'll be interested to see, Kevin, too, if other school districts follow suit and make this information quite public so that parents, teachers, other educators can have direct information.
Right. I mean, K-12 and higher ed, I think we're going to be watching really closely to see how do districts and how do colleges and universities provide this information. At the higher education level, U of I and Idaho State University have web pages with up-to-date coronavirus case numbers. Boise State is working on a page that they hope to go live with in the next few days, so that parents, students, community can watch and see what's happening.
Kevin, one of the other topics we have talked about so much here on Making the Grade over the summer, and it came to a head last week during the governor's special session, was the liability immunity law. Now law. It was a bill. Now it's been signed into law by the governor, basically shielding in some ways school districts from lawsuits if somebody contracts COVID-19 with inside their buildings. What was the general consensus after this law was passed? Because you even had some education groups, including the Idaho Education Association, arguing against this bill. How does this help or perhaps not help schools as they're trying to decide whether or not to bring students back inside their buildings?
I'm going to be really curious to see what kind of effect this really has. The school boards and school administrators have been pushing for this law. They said that they needed some sort of protection, some sort of assurance that if a school district exercises due diligence, they take care, they take precautions, and there's still a link to a coronavirus case from the schools, that the school district is not does not have civil liability. Now, I'm really curious if that's really going to have a significant effect on whether schools can open or remain open, because I think the case numbers and the spread of coronavirus, that's going to dictate what happens at K-12 and at the colleges and universities. I think that's going to have much more of an impact than this liability law, but we'll see.
Let's talk a little bit about higher education. You mentioned it just then. Boise State, you reported on a story this week talking about how Boise State's done a little bit of its own crackdown. We had already seen this at the University of Idaho 2 weeks ago, with larger groups getting together, parties off campus, and there being some crackdown there. Now it's happened right here in Boise State. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened?
Right. So on Friday, Boise State announced that 3 fraternities and I want to say 18 students were placed on suspension because they were involved with large gatherings that violated the university's coronavirus policy. This is something we've been kind of watching to see and waiting to see if it would happen. And as you mentioned, University of Idaho had similar concerns and similar issues crop up before the semester opened last week. This is going to be a very critical time. These first couple of weeks as students return to college and university campuses, what happens with those case numbers? That's going to be really telling, because and I think university administrators will tell you that their bigger concern right now is, are students doing the right things and behaving and taking proper precautions outside of the classroom setting? On the weekends, in the evenings, on their downtime, what happens with kids, and how do kids gather or not gather? Do they adhere to restrictions on large gatherings, restrictions on social distancing? We're already seeing signs that it's a problem. It's been a problem at U of I, and now it's been a problem at Boise State, and it's been a big problem with colleges and universities around the country, where you've seen spikes and you've seen hundreds of cases. Right now, the numbers at U of I and Boise State are not, at that magnitude, and you hope that it stays that way. But these large gatherings and these social gatherings are a serious concern for college administrators.
It was interesting to me in that report that you did at Idaho Ed News, that the staff did there, you were reporting that only 5 of the beds at Boise State, meaning dorm rooms that have been set aside for students who come down with COVID, are actually filled right now, those living on campus. And I don't know, I took that to be a very good sign that there wasn't this overwhelming jump in numbers once students returned to campus. And Boise State's been trying to do testing as well to make sure that they know what's going to happen with their student population.
They're hoping to ramp up testing here this month and have a much more extensive student testing. But, we're still very early in this. You're right that only 5 of the 115 isolation beds are in use right now, but it does take time for the coronavirus to incubate. Students have just returned to campus here in the past week and a half. I think we really have to see where we are in a couple of weeks. I think these next couple of weeks are going to be very telling as far as how the experiment of reopening colleges and universities in Idaho, how it really works out.
Let's talk about enrollment numbers too, Kevin, because you just posted a story at idahoednews.org, if people would like to go and read it, talking specifically about community colleges around the state, right here in the Treasure Valley, CWI, College of Western Idaho, hoping that they wouldn't see their enrollment decline, but it looks like it will perhaps slightly for fall, even though they are offering a whole hybrid of options to students. And I was also curious with this story, Kevin, you can talk a little bit about this, as students may choose to not go to a four-year institution because of whatever COVID-19 is doing in their own lives or their families' lives, or they just don't want to deal with going away from home, perhaps. You know, you would think that maybe perhaps the community colleges would have seen an increase in enrollment with some of those students deciding on that model for their lives instead. So what did you find out?
Well, it's kind of a mixed bag for the community colleges across the state. A couple are expecting to see some enrollment increases. CSI and College of Eastern Idaho in Idaho Falls are expecting increases. CWI, the decrease is not as dramatic as college officials had been fearing. What they're looking at right now, and the numbers are not final. We'll get better data here in the weeks to come. Right now, it looks like it's going to be about a 2% enrollment decrease, but the college had been bracing for a decrease more on the order of 15%, which would have had a much more significant effect on finances. So a 2% decrease, again, not nearly the kind of drop off that CWI had expected. It just does come, though, on the heels of, we've seen it, years of really rapid growth on the CWI campus.
We had the opportunity, Kevin, to talk with Dr. Burt Glandon during one of our town halls, Safely Back to School town halls. And as he said, he had braced for a budget cut already to make sure that they could handle the reports that were coming in nationally, as you said, of major enrollment hits this fall. So again, I look at a 2% number and think, that still shows that CWI is probably on the uptrend of all community colleges across the United States.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I think, I don't know what's happening nationwide with community college enrollment, but I suspect that there are a lot of community colleges around the country that would take a 2% decrease and be pretty happy to manage off of that. Community college enrollment is an interesting thing, and you kind of touched on it a little bit. In a down economy, community college enrollment especially tends to spike. People go back to school. They go and they, complete some coursework, or they go back and they try to get some professional training so that they're ready to jump back into the job market when the job market improves. So, it tends to be kind of, counter-cyclical. In a good economy, people go into the workforce. In a down economy, a lot of people look to go back to school or look to go to school. So, but this is a whole different environment, where, you have to factor in as well that maybe people are uneasy about going to college, going to face-to-face learning. CWI is going with a lot of different options to allow students to learn online, to learn in a hybrid setting, to learn, completely online, in a kind of a real-time online class, or an online class that they can take on their own time, on their own schedule. So a lot of different options available for students.
Let's switch gears a little bit, Kevin. I want to touch on a story that Idaho Ed News wrote about, talking about our state superintendent, Sherry Ibarra. She had to not present her budget, but on September 1st, budgets are due from state agencies. And of course, the education budget is one we look at closely, not because we cover education, but also because it's basically 50% of the state budget itself. It is a huge amount of our tax dollars going into public education. And the main takeaway from Superintendent Ibarra's budget is that she wants to ask the legislature to unfreeze teacher pay, because as we have reported many times here on Making the Grade, one of the things the governor is asking for is that 5% reduction in costs across the state agencies. But Sherry Ibarra is hoping that the teacher pay raises on the career ladder can continue, and she's asking for that.
Right. So it sets up an interesting dynamic between the state superintendent and the governor, and down the road with the legislature. When Governor Little announced unless you make some major changes between now and January, we've got a pretty good idea of the blueprint. That's what she brings to the legislature at the end of January. Then the budget committee has to sort it out and figure out what sort of budget bill they want to write, or budget bills they want to write for K-12, because it takes the form of multiple pieces of legislation. So, it's a 6-month process, and come March, we'll see exactly where the legislature wants to go with this budget.
Kevin, before we take a few more comments from Making the Grade here, we appreciate everybody joining us live here on Facebook. Let's just quickly mention that there is an election happening today. And if you're in the Boise School District, listen up, because your vote counts today.
Yeah, kind of a standalone one-off election in the Boise School District. 2 school board seats are up for grabs. You have 3 candidates running. Dennis Stone, who's an incumbent, the former Boise fire chief, Nancy Gregory, who's been on the board for 18 years, and James Tuman, a parent who's been involved in a Head Start's policy council. 3 candidates, 2 school board seats. Everybody runs at large, so nobody's running against anybody per se. So there are no seats. So the top 2 vote getters get elected. They serve 6-year terms. And if you scroll down in our piece, the list of polling places within the Boise district, it's kind of regionalized. So, look there and see the closest polling place. And polls are open, I want to say, until 8 o'clock tonight.
That's correct, 8 o'clock. Let's take a few more comments before we finish up on Making the Grade. Adam had a good point here, Kevin, and I want to refer to a story that Idaho Edmonds did. And he's saying, what about parents that work full time? We're talking now about kids going back to school or online learning. How are they supposed to be home with their kids to do schoolwork and go to work full time? There is an excellent story at idahoednews.org. I don't know if you're gonna have to remind me. I think maybe Sammy did it as the reporter.
But wrote that story, and it's a very good piece looking at
really good.
Exactly the tensions that Adam's talking about in his comment. I mean, it's difficult for any parent, but especially for parents who work full time and have to work full time away from home. I mean, not everybody has a job that affords you the luxury of work from home. So it's tough. It's tough for a lot of parents. It was tough for a lot of parents in the spring, and it still is.
This is an interesting comment here from Lowell. If they open the schools, I won't be seeing my grandkids for the next 9 months. How many of you want them open because you don't want to pay a babysitter? Interesting, but I'm guessing, Lowell, that you are saying that there because you're worried for your own health if kids go back into school. And I do have to admit that in my own personal life, that's something we're battling with my mom. If kids go back into school, there's just so many decisions that families have to make and exceptions that they have to make. And as we see your comments and hear your comments, the thing is that it has to be individual choice, right? I mean, that's what school districts are finding too, with offering these virtual options, that it's not a one size fits all for any family.
Right. And as we talked about earlier, the number of parents who are opting now for online learning, exclusive online learning, those numbers are going to be very interesting, and we have more coverage coming on what's happening with virtual education and virtual education enrollment.
And how virtual education, it may be the next wave of the future in education. I mean, in the West Ada district, they have a principal in place for that school in particular. So to see how administrators, how top people in education are going to revamp the way education is done, because for some students, it will be what's best. And of course, for many others, it will not.
Right. I mean, again, I think we're learning this all over, but I think we kind of knew going in that for some kids, online learning is a really, really good option, really viable option. For some kids, it just doesn't work as well.
And it's hard. Parents, we get it. It's hard. It's just hard. Kevin, we love to end these segments on something totally ridiculous and fun, because no matter what your opinion is on COVID-19, no matter what the facts are, Kevin always brings a little bit of light to making the grade to make me smile and laugh in the midst of my own dealing with the pandemic. So instead of Kevin's socks today, which we normally have him show off his socks for us because he's a sock connoisseur, today we got to take a little bit of a harder take on this segment, Kevin, because you actually have some hardware you'd like to show us.
Yeah, sure.
What'd you get, buddy?
In the background, this is my hobby. I run, I race, but most races are on hold. I mean, most races have gone virtual for obvious reasons. They don't want a bunch of us standing around in close quarters, breathing on each other before and after a race. So most races have gone virtual. So my summer project was a race across, well, theoretically, virtually across the state of New York. Here I am.
Oh,
yes.
Put it up a little bit.
Where am I? Where? You think this
there
is?
You go.
This is like about the largest medal I've ever gotten for a race. I mean, and it's not just that it's large. I mean, it is large, but it spins too. So we can get New York State to spin. See, am I going to get the tassel? Here we go. Yeah, look at go. I'll be playing with this for an hour today. So
I love it.
Until August, I ran the equivalent of Buffalo, New York to Albany, New York, which is about 310 miles. And this is the reward for it. And we start another one next week. We start another one next week that'll be about 400 miles between day after Labor Day and Christmas Eve. So, it'll take.
What state are you running across there?
This one, they set it up that you're running from Washington, D.C. to Syracuse. This thing is all based in Syracuse, and the organizers are they're Syracuse University alums, and Syracuse's big basketball rivalry back in the day, the old school basketball days, was Georgetown, which is in Washington, D.C. So this was the D.C. to Syracuse run. So 400 miles between now and Christmas Eve, which will be a nice distraction from everything else.
I love that. And I think you just gave PE teachers all across the state of Idaho a brilliant idea. If students have to be online at certain points, that maybe we should have a run across or up Idaho, because that would be some serious mileage.
And a shout out, a lot of the local race organizers have been really creative about trying to come up with virtual options. So, there are ways for PE teachers, there are ways for parents to try to get, kids to be engaged, because, you can't do this face to face right now. You can't do it in big crowds. You're trying to, keep it safe for everybody. But, you want to, it's still safe to get out if you do it, with proper distancing from everybody. So.
And now you can wear your medal around town.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much I can wear it. It's gonna weigh me down.
That's your new training piece. Really. Kevin, proud of you, buddy. Proud of all that you're doing. Thank you to everyone over at Idaho Education News. The continued stories on how life has changed dramatically and how life will continue to change in education during this. We appreciate you giving us your thoughts and your insight, and I would encourage everybody to go to idahoednews.org to read up on those stories. And specifically, if you want to see some really sweet pictures from the Boys and Girls Club and how working parents, we hear you, we get you, that this is not easy, no matter what the choices are. I would highly suggest that you go online and look at those stories. Kevin, thank you.
Thank you. See you next week.
Thanks everybody for being here, for making the grade. We'll see you next week.